Program, B.S. English. Course, Literary Criticism. Topic, Plato's Charges Against Poetry. Prepared by, Dr. Shahryar Khan. Question. What were the charges brought against poetry by Plato? How did Aristotle defend poetry? Introduction. In his book The Republic, Plato discussed his ideas about establishment of an ideal state. In his discussion, Plato philosophically analyzed different institutions of his republic. In the 9th book of The Republic, he examined the educational system of an ideal state. In the Greek society, the poets and the writers were taught in the educational institutions, for it was believed that poetry helps in character building of the youth. It was also believed that poets were the natural teachers and they provide proper guidance for the youth of the nation. But Plato holds this view that poetry and poets do not provide an ideal foundation for the character building. Therefore, he raised many objections against poetry. Point 1. His first objection was that poetry is immoral and illogical. Poetry is irrational and corrupts the mind of the youth. He says that poetry is imitative art, just like music, dancing or painting. The poets imitate not the reality but the appearance of the reality. According to the philosophy of Plato, this world is only appearance and the real world is the world of ideas which exists in some other realm. All the things that we see in this world are the copies of those ideas. He quotes an example that when a carpenter makes a table, he first conceives the idea of the table, and when the table is made, it is the imitation of that idea. All the original ideas exist in some other realm. In poetry, the poets write about the things of the world and, in this way, they are imitating something which is already an imitation. Hence his objection that poetry is the imitation of imitation and thus twice removed from reality. On this basis, it becomes irrational and cannot be taken as proper course for the training of youth. Point 2. Poetry is based upon inspiration rather than reason. The poet claims that he composes poetry under the influence of divine beings, that is, muses. In this way, poetry is not conscious art based upon reason but inspired by some external agency. Plato says that poets are not in their right state of mind when they utter unknown and strange ideas. He says, the poets compose not by art but by power divine. When they have a fit of poetic inspiration, they cease to have their own specific personality. On the basis of this argument, poetry again proves to be illogical and irrational. Point 3. Greeks also believed that the poets pass through a spiritual creative process which was akin to frenzy. They claimed that their mind is under the influence of muses, but there is no evidence to prove this fact. Consequently, the frenzied, insane or possessed mind cannot be the proper guidance for the youth. Plato also accused poets of telling lies about gods and religion. He says, many of the stories that poet tells about the gods and heroes are false and immoral. Gods are great and heroes have descended from heaven, therefore they are flawless. In poetry, gods are presented as corrupt, dishonest, and vicious, like human beings, participating in wars, committing various human sins and things like that. Moreover, the tragedians encourage lawlessness and violence which appeal to the basic animal instincts in man. The poets also preach the sensational, melodramatic, and wicked side of love. Point 3 continues. Keeping in view these drawbacks, poetry cannot be prescribed for the educational cultivation of the youth. In his 10th book of The Republic, Plato declares, poetry feeds and waters the emotions instead of drying them up. It feeds them when they ought to be starved and makes them control us when we ought to control them. In the light of above statement, the excited emotions encourage weakness in the readers. For example, in case of tragedy, people express their emotions in public while actually they would be ashamed of these emotions in the real life. Weeping in public is unmanly and cowardly act which every honorable person avoids, but poetry is so sensational that we forget about our sense of honor and weep in public upon seeing an imaginary situation. In fact, poetry appeals to the irrational part of the soul and, therefore, it is immoral. Point 1. Aristotle answered the charges of Plato by saying that poetry is not the imitation of imitation. He says that poetry is not imitation of men but men in action. Actions of a man are manifestations of his mind and consequently, his character. When a poet writes poetry about men, he is representing their character. Aristotle says that in this way poetry does not imitate the imitation but it imitates the ideal reality. Aristotle's conception of ideal reality is that in poetry, poets do not present common people but they present people who have certain idealized qualities. And in this way poetry is not imitation of imitation but presentation of idealized reality. Point 1. Aristotle answered the charges of Plato by saying that poetry is not the imitation of imitation. He says that poetry is not imitation of men but men in action. Actions of a man are manifestations of his mind and consequently, his character. When a poet writes poetry about men, he is representing their character. Aristotle says that in this way poetry does not imitate the imitation but it imitates the ideal reality. Aristotle's conception of ideal reality is that in poetry, poets do not present common people but they present people who have certain idealized qualities. And in this way poetry is not imitation of imitation but presentation of idealized reality. Point 2. Aristotle says that the poet is the maker of something new and he is a creative artist, not a possessed one. A poet composes poetry by conveying the emotions which he observes. In this way, he creates something which is also felt by the reader when he reads that poetry. The poet imitates and recreates life and it is not something which is written under the influence of external agency. Plato condemned poetry on moral, intellectual, and emotional grounds. Aristotle says that poetry has its own moral, intellectual and emotional purposes. His theory of catharsis demonstrates the healthy influence which poetry exercises over the emotions. The end.